So, Councilmember Harless, if you don't mind doing the kind of normal kind of protocol, and then we'll jump in and I'll have documents to share in a discussion, and we'll kind of get as much out of this next 90 minutes as possible. So.
Okay, that sounds great. And you can hear me all right? Yeah, okay, good. This microphone sometimes fades out, so just let me know or interrupt me, and then I'll just switch to a different mic if needed. So yeah, we'll call this meeting to order. It is now 12:31 p.m. and we'll do a quick roll call. If you don't mind doing that, Kimberly.
Yep. Chair Harless.
Present.
Committee Member Bowers.
Here.
Lentz.
Here.
Konevsky. I don't know if Janet's here yet. I think she was maybe or maybe not. Kenny.
I believe she was hoping to, but she's traveling. So
yeah.
Kenny. Here.
Rust.
Here.
Goldman.
I'm here, thank you.
Hart.
Here.
And Bryce.
Here.
And Ryan, you were able to make it. Good to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So it's only one person and they gave notice that, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like to entertain a motion to excuse them. And that was Janet, right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, they're excused. Next is the approval of the May 22nd minutes. Take a moment to look at those, and I'll entertain a motion for those approval when someone's ready.
Motion to approve. Second.
Okay, so a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, minutes are approved. So next we'll move into our big agenda item. Thank you for the extensive memo. It was really informative. And would you like to lead? Yeah, you are leading this discussion. So let me know how you would like me to be involved. Just reach out. But I have several questions too. And then I know that some questions were submitted by Janet. So I would just like us to take a moment to, I know you responded to one of them, but we should also address those questions and share that with the group as well.
Yep. Thank you, Chair Harless. And let me stop sharing the agenda at the moment. So the way I kind of teed this up is would like to walk through the actual memo. Just maybe not, I'm not going to read it, but let's hit the high points of what's in that memo. And certainly you can ask kind of some clarifying questions along the way. I did pose a couple starter discussion questions at the end, but for example, as Chair Harless mentioned, Janet posed some questions. You all are going to have some questions, and what today's goal is really, I don't know if we're necessarily officially deciding anything, but we want to clarify where we can, if we can kind of agree to things, that's great. I do have some presentations that can be used to supplement the memo, although quite frankly, everything that's in the presentations is in the memo. So if it's easier to see some presentations, we can do that. And again, the big goal here is, I think, to align on our budget approach for this year, as well as indicated in the memo, how we want to structure the grant programs, which is a significant driver of obviously the budget and the resources needed. So that's kind of the starting point. And then we'll kind of take it kind of from there. note questions you have along the way, try and answer them today, whether that's from myself, Jonathan, Natasha is on the call as well. Andrew, who's our financial analyst within our department, can probably help with certain things. But it's really the main goal here is to provide clarity and a sense of direction. This whole budget conversation, I think, will take several meetings. So we do have a July meeting on the book. We purposely in that meeting schedule for the year left it unassigned. We don't have any topics, but my guess is we may need to use that July meeting to kind of further this conversation and make some decisions there. So if does that feel good for everybody? It's a bit of a, work in progress as we kind of work through this. All right. So with that, let me share the memo. I know sharing a Word document isn't always, let me put it this way, virtual meeting people would say don't do it, but I'm doing it. And let me actually increase the font here a bit, make it a little bit easier to read, and we'll go from there. Okay, so elements in the memo, we wanted to kind of clarify to make sure we're all on the same page. The first section here is really outlining kind of what resources are currently assigned to the lodging tax program. Some of these numbers are kind of current numbers and they grow and they change, but that's where I've designated like 2024 value, those types of things. And these are my words too. So these technically, if we need to change some of this, we can. But there are two fund reserves, as I'm calling them, associated with LTAC. One is the $2.9 million city debt service guarantee. That the 2024 value is $2.9 million. For that, I think when Natasha presented several meetings ago, she walked through the purpose of that, a requirement for our debt service. And then there is a $6.3 million cash reserves for future tourism programmatic or capital expenditures. That 6.3 million is a 2024 value. Technically, these may be all in the same bucket, but I wanted to separate them out for kind of our conversation a bit. So those are our fund reserves. And then annually, the city generates approximately, because as you can see here, it changes by year. We annually generate approximately $3 million in lodging tax revenues. And based on city council precedent, 50% of that goes towards debt service, the debt service of the convention center, city convention center, and the other 50%, so approximately 1.5 million, is what we're primarily discussing today, how we want to utilize that and make recommendations to council through this current budget process. So with all these numbers on the screen, what the focus of today primarily is about is that 1.5 million for LTAC to consider and make recommendations to council. Why don't I pause there? Any clarifying questions? Jonathan, Natasha, Chair Harless, please jump in if you have better ways of kind of phrasing what I just did. But any questions about kind of the resources associated with LTAC at the moment?
Is that number higher than normal? I know it went down during COVID, and I've only been on the council committee, I think, 1.5 years, but 1.5 million feels higher than in the past.
It's a good, so what you, and this gets into a little bit of the nuance. City council has in the city's baseline budget, Andrew, jump in if I'm using the wrong terms here. There's a baseline budget associated with LTAC, primarily for grants to events and festivals, and the grant that we've annually made to Visit Vancouver of a little over 800,000.
Okay.
So that's in the baseline, but technically 50% of the approximately $3 million that comes in is available for LTAC recommendations. Now, if we go through this process, we'll start it today. Again, we'll probably have conversations in July. There's a whole budget process that goes through the summer and the fall. If recommendations go beyond that baseline, that's going to require a council approval for that, either in this biennium's budget or after the fact in a what we call like a spring supplemental. So that may be what you're referring to as like, oh, I didn't realize we had 1.5. We've always had like 800,000 or whatever the number is. It's the difference between what's in a baseline budget and what is potentially available upon council approval.
Thank you.
Please, someone clarify if I'm not using the right terms or if I'm confusing there. So,
Chris, I've got a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interject. So if you want to finish your
go ahead.
thought. Okay. So on that 6.3 million cash reserve, is it possible to get a kind of a clarification or definition of what a tourism programmatic or a capital expenditure would be? Like, what are we using this fund for? What's it being held for?
I don't think the city, and
Oh,
part of the
the top-
reason why I'm not framing it as a discussion right now is I don't think the city has clarified its intent. And I think it could go towards things like future convention center expansion. It could go towards other investments as well. So it hasn't been defined what that is necessarily being used for. And no action has been taken on that by either our public facilities district or council.
Hi, this is Natasha. What
Yep.
you've stated is correct. So far, this reserve has been linked to the remaining debt service payments past the expiration of the sales tax credit that is expiring in 2026. So but again, no, you're right in that no specific, beyond that, no specific allocations from that dollar amount have been made.
So Natasha, I guess a follow-up question for me would be then, so if I add in that 2.9 and the 6.3, this is what you were explaining on your
Yep.
last visit. It
Yes.
makes up the minimum requirement that you need to cover
Exactly.
the bond once the
Exactly.
bond runs out. Okay. So my next question would be then is so Chris, in listening to you, you're saying sorry, I mean, I don't mean to, this is going to kind of skip ahead a little bit, but extra funds that were put aside of the 1.5 that we're talking about, which I guess is still there's a little bit of disparity, right? If we collected 3.7, 50% approximately of that would be 1.85, right? But of the 1.5 million that we're talking about previously, to your point, with last year, approximately 800,000, the remaining 700,000 went up to this cash reserve. We wouldn't need to then fund this anymore, right? So the 50% would truly be coming to LTAC, potentially?
Well, I think it would be available for LTAC to make a recommendation to council. I think it's going to be up to council to determine, are they approving expenditures beyond what's in the baseline? So I think part of this conversation is if LTAC is making a recommendation for the full 50% and again, for ease, we're just talking 1.5. Sure. I know, I think LTAC has the authority to recommend expenditures and investments for that full amount. But it's ultimately up to council to approve that full amount. So it's going to require, as we always do in the fall, a council conversation about LTAC's recommendations.
Okay, and then
I'll kind of jump in just for a second and just maybe as a vignette, give you an example of what I've seen working well with other organizations that were involved in the grant making activity here at the city is putting together a prioritization that accompanies the request, essentially defining how you would like to see promotion of Vancouver. What would be the biggest bang for the buck? How you're going to define it? How the dollars are going to be allocated? Are those going to be mostly targeting heads and beds, or is it just the day visitors to the city? And what we're trying to get out of it. Once you have the prioritization criteria put together, and that creates a little more of a coherent story. It has the purpose, it has the vision, it has the deliverables. Then in the past, it has been much easier for the city finance area to actually make a recommendation to city council, because it's actually based on expectations and goals and data, the specifics, and then followed up ideally in the year after with a report that reports back to city council saying, here's what the grants were awarded, here, the specific goals, and this is the report of how those goals have been reached. So something in those types of lines that would accompany the request for additional increase to the baseline would make it a much stronger argument than just additional funding and we'll figure out how to spend it. At least that's what worked historically.
But to clarify, we need to allocate the dollar amount that's been committed to Visit Vancouver on their contract, correct?
Their amount is decided every year. We have a contract for services with them, but every year we do a new contract.
Right, but it comes out of the 1.5.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yes.
Okay.
So
And
it
then
also talks about, sorry, just Steve, but it also talks about the, administrative fees and that come out of this budget on the top line as well. Do we know approximately how much we spend in a year that is administrative coming out of the total 3.7 before we get into breaking up the rest out?
Two things on that. Natasha, like a lot of other programs the city administers, there's a cost allocation for things like IT, HR, right? So Natasha, I'll let you kind of speak to that piece of it. What we have never done within, I'll just, so LTAC is overseen by myself. I'm in the Economic Prosperity and Housing Department. We've never associated any of our time to LTAC. And we do have the authority, or I guess the RCWs allow us to do that. We're going through a process right now to estimate that. We've always taken that out of our general fund, but we can pay for that out of LTAC. And a little bit of context for one is, I think we're all coming to better clarity about this program. So I think that's an element of this. The other is just from a city budget perspective, we have a structural deficit that is requiring us to make cuts to the general fund. So from a city department level, if we want basically the level of service you're getting this year, we need to be able to assign those administrative and staff costs to LTAC. Otherwise, we're going to be taking cuts to our general fund that we probably won't be able to support LTAC at the level we have been like this year going forward. So there's both of it is we've just never done it, and we should have a conversation about that. And then we are in a unique situation in this biennial budget of making cuts to our general fund. So it also helps us maintain the staffing levels that you need. Chair Harless, Jonathan, if you want to jump in with any more of that as well.
Yeah, and to add to that, in an average year, we spend probably close to like 30 to 40,000 for banking fees, audit fees, inclusion in the report. So that those kind of the basic admin costs that we allocate to each and every fund of the city.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know how much more we would be looking at for the staffing costs that Chris is speaking about?
Andrew and I are working on that because it's having us go back and kind of make some sort of estimate on how have we done it in previous years. We're actually doing a lot more this year than previous years because of, we're going through the criteria process, and part of what we're trying to tee up also is what is the level of service we want LTAC? What's the, kind of the programmatic focus will play into that. So what I'm proposing here is we will be coming to you with our administrative cost proposal for you to review and comment on as part of this. We're not quite there yet. I'm going to make a guess. In total, this will all be under probably $100,000.
And Chris, that'll include anything, I know we've talked about along the way, maybe some changes to websites and things. That this estimate will include all of proposals that the LTAC committee is coming up with changes to
That's
the
a good point right there. I hadn't had in my early notes, I hadn't done things like website, but yes, it would include costs associated with that. Any, like Matthew and Whereabout, who we're consulting with right now, we're paying that out of our general fund. That's not even being paid out of LTAC. If we had gone through this process last year, we'd probably be paying for his services out of LTAC, and we're not. So and again, I've explained our general fund situation. So things like that can't always predict in the future some of those needs, but I think we're going to be able to come up with a pretty, an informed estimate of what that looks like each year in some of that.
Okay, and then the questions that I had, I guess, to follow up from what Natasha was speaking about earlier. So first part A is, and if it's okay, I'll ask them both, and then you guys can answer. Maybe it's more than just Natasha that answers these questions, but 6.3 million, that part of the cash reserve, who ultimately has the decision on what that's going to be made currently? So is that something that if the city says, hey, we're going to use it on XYZ program, they have to come to LTAC, and then LTAC gives the recommendation, and then the council approves? Does the city budgeting group just go and make a recommendation to council, and they do it without LTAC? And then the second part of this question would be that, I'd just like to, I guess it's more of a statement. I just want to make sure that everybody remembers on here that these are lodging tax dollars that are being collected through lodging. And my personal opinion is sitting in a cash reserve. While I understand we may have some obligations, if those are met, I would much rather see us utilize those funds to try to attract more additional revenue for tax dollars than sit in a general fund that may not ever be used.
Well, I'll jump in and then I'll ask Jonathan to jump in as well. Well, the dollars are not sitting in the general fund. The dollars are sitting kind of in the dedicated tourism fund, separated away from other funds. And so far, council has dedicated those dollars until the current debt is paid and the obligations are fulfilled on the current convention center. In order to redesignate the dollars, so if city council said, okay, we're just going to repurpose the money and do something entirely different, they would have to share their recommendation with the Lodging Tax Advisory Group, which is your group. And then it might be helpful, Jonathan, if you could jump in and maybe speak a little bit to that subtlety.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me with you this afternoon. So to the first question of approval process, the punchline of the question is city council is always the final decision-making authority on the spending of lodging tax funds. The question of how it gets there depends on what you want to spend it on. So if the desire is to spend LTAC funds on tourism or advertising or promotion of a special event, then those are the sorts of recommendations that are enumerated on a slate from lodging tax, this recipient, this amount, and those are forwarded to city council for their review. City council needs to only consider the recipients that LTAC has identified as potential recipients of those special event dollars. If it's things like capital expenses for a facility that's owned by the city, then there's a different process, and the same process applies for things like administrative overhead expenses, where city spending LTAC dollars on city expenses, that's a process that needs to be, LTAC needs to be informed of that recommendation and needs to be given an opportunity to weigh in and give feedback and comment. But ultimately, that's a a recommendation from city staff to city council with the input and comment of LTAC. I hope that helps.
So yeah, just to clarify, if city wanted to use these funds for a capital expenditure, and that was the recommendation that was given, and they inform LTAC, and LTAC doesn't agree, the city council can still override LTAC, is what you're saying, correct?
That's correct. It's an opportunity for comment and feedback, really using the collective wisdom and expertise of LTAC, but it's a decision that rests with city council.
From a process standpoint, if we compare LTAC to other boards and commissions, what I would say just similar authority is part of what we would do is be working with city leaders, council to understand kind of intent, working with you to kind of respond to that intent and package something or perhaps a recommendation that goes. So it's a little bit kind of, it's not always done in isolation like we just find out. I think there's conversations between staff and city leadership and our elected officials discussing that, bringing it to LTAC for conversation and input and feedback. But ultimately, then we would take that and submit to council, and council has final approval. So I would hope it'd be a collaborative process, but I think what Jonathan is saying, ultimately, like everything in the city, council makes final decisions on this stuff.
Okay,
And
so
just to add in, Chris's comment is fantastic and is really, I couldn't agree more that, really process-wise, this does look very similar to other board and commission relationships with city council. And really, when I think about the interaction, it looks closest to the interaction between some of the most sophisticated boards, as you would expect, like the Planning Commission, where we have rules in place that require that the Planning Commission give city council their input and insight on major land use decisions made across the city. But then city council is ultimately the body that needs to wrestle with those and figure out how they interplay with the city's long-term vision, other community stakeholder inputs, things like that. So,
Chris, it's been several years since I went through my orientation for the board. And that during that time, we were given a binder that had information about how this worked. I believe my memory could be a little off, so I'm going to ask maybe we can get a refresh copy of this, but I believe that I was told that city council could not spend any lodging tax dollars without a recommendation from lodging tax board. So if that's not the case, I'd just like to see whatever that updated rule or regulation, and apologize in advance if I'm not using the correct term, but whatever that change is in the program, I think it would be beneficial to see that kind of written out if possible. And I think in what previous email I sent over, I think that was one of my questions that I had asked. So I'm happy to send that back over to you, Chris, again, if that's something that we could see.
Sure, Jonathan, or sorry, yeah, go ahead, Chair Harless.
Yeah, I just want to also keep mindful of time. I do have a hard stop at 2, so I won't be able to go over today. I want to make sure we get through the whole document. Just to follow up, because City Council was mentioned, it's very uncommon for City Council to not go with a recommendation of a committee or board or commission. One, it's politically suicidal. And 2, that's why we have boards and commissions, is because City Council can't be the experts in everything. And so and then also per RCWs, it's sometimes required too. And the requirement is really there to ensure that there are different voices that are being heard. That's why there's the breakup of LTAC in different sectors. So I just wanted to add that in. If that is a fear by anybody, it is not, like, it's highly unlikely that usually city councils will go with recommendations by their boards and commissions. So I just want to make sure we progress through the document, given that we've already are half an hour in. So if there's any more additional topics on the first section, please, if we have extra time at the end, or can follow up through email.
Thank you. Eligible use of funds, I'm gonna go this relatively quick because I think we have more familiarity with this. We can use funds for tourism marketing. We can use funds for marketing and operations of special events and festivals designed to attract tourists. And we have a definition down below of what it means to attract tourists. I won't go into that. Capital expenditures and operating expenses of tourism-related facilities owned or operated by a municipality or public facilities district. So those have to be publicly owned. And then operating expenses of tourism-related nonprofits. That's what's defined in RCW for how LTAC resources can be used. And then this paragraph down here is just clarifying that we do have the LTAC, the RCWs does allow for administrative staff costs to be covered by those revenues. Given the conversations that we've had in previous meetings, drawing a bit on where at least the current conversations have gone related to things like the criteria we're developing. Although that's not complete, that's the next meeting, right? So we're in a bit of in progress as we work through this. What we're proposing here is kind of a framework for you to consider of how we, and again, I'm focusing on the 1.5 million of how we would handle the grant process this year. And so what we've done is broken the grant out into 4 separate categories. One is we would have a grant application for emerging event or festivals. So I think we've acknowledged internally that this application would maybe be more simple than the next category, which I'll get into. But the awards would also be capped at a smaller amount. And the purpose of this is to help kind of early events or festivals get off the ground with the hope that they become larger, more established events and festivals over time. We have in here a threshold of these emerging or new events or festivals have to be less than 3 years old. So that's category 1. Category 2 is established event or festival grants. This would require a more robust, probably, application. There wouldn't necessarily be an award cap, although we'd have to make decisions within the framework of overall resources. An event or festival could not receive a grant award more than 2 times unless it can demonstrate a change in approach or scope to significantly attract more attendees or reach new communities. And what this is basically saying is, if you're an established event and you've received an award, get it twice, but in order to get it any more than that, you have to demonstrate what is changing that's either going to put you in a position to attract more attendees or to reach new audiences, new communities, those types of things. So, and again, we haven't developed the application for this yet, but that's kind of the proposal there. The third area is nonprofit tourism organization operating grants. So officially designated nonprofit tourism organizations would be eligible for annual operating grants. We would expect this is where Visit Vancouver applies for. And in the past, I think we've done a presentation. We may kind of have a little bit to keep it consistent with the other grant areas, have a bit of an application for that appropriate one. So that would fund organizations like Visit Vancouver. And then the third would be catalytic tourism program or capital expense grants. So organizations could apply for non-event festival grants. So this isn't money going to an event or festival to support the growth of the tourism industry, as long as those proposals meet the eligible use of lodging tax funds as outlined in RCW. Now, what's an example of this? An example of this could be the one grant you guys approved last year between the Farmers Market and the Historical Society for kiosks. Now, for reasons I don't want to get into today, that one ended up being not eligible because of the applicant wasn't a public facility and it was deemed a capital expenditure. But it could be something like that. That's not really an event or festival, but they want to make some sort of catalytic programmatic investment or capital expense grant. So some of this you've already been doing. What we're doing is kind of bucketing these into different categories, so that we can communicate and kind of seek impactful projects around that. So 4 different grants. We would have to, what's in front of us is if we move forward with something like this, is we would have to, this would be very clear. If you're this organization seeking these types of funds, here's the grant you should apply under. And then LTAP would evaluate these proposals and make a recommendation, a separate recommendation for each of these 4 categories. So in theory, we would be taking to council 4 different budget recommendations, 1 for emerging events and festivals, 1 for established, 1 for nonprofit tourism organizations, and 1 for catalytic tourism program or capital expenses. So the council would weigh in on each of those 4 separately. Anyone else who's been in these kind of internal conversations want to add to that, or any questions about where we're headed? Any concern?
I
We're not
have a
suggesting
question.
this is final. We're proposing.
I have a question on category number 1. And I know I had mentioned this before, but with the emerging events and festivals, historically, we have seen them asking for sometimes larger amounts because they're really the ones that are still trying to get their funding, get the, the event, get their feet underneath them. Can we revisit the amount of money or maybe not cap it depending on the size of the event? We did have before it due to, situations and circumstances, it ended up not happening. The event didn't happen, but they had asked for a sizable grant. But they had a great potential, and it was something that the group unanimously had been in favor of. So I don't know that we necessarily want to, in my opinion, cap that, because it can be the first year or 2 that they need additional funding, and then they really can get going and sustain on their own, finding other revenue streams. So just a suggestion.
To add to that, this is Christy. Is there a way that we could do it? Multiple day events tend to generate lodging tax by guest room, encouraging the guest rooms. Could this be something that could be related to the number of days the event would be?
I'm not sure I'm following, but if others are, jump in.
Christy, I think that would be a good thing when they were doing the grid to add, bonus scoring in that grid for having a multiple day event would weigh them heavier.
Really,
I think
really good point there. I want to emphasize is all 4 of these categories, and I've actually shared this with Matthew as he's thinking about the categories right now. So again, we got lots of things going on at the same time. We would expect these criteria that you've been discussing, and he's putting together a tool. We would use the tool for each of these categories in some way. Now, we're not quite there yet. I haven't seen the categories. I haven't seen the tool, but each of these programs would be evaluated under something like that. And I know that wasn't a question, but I just wanted to clarify that these criteria you're developing would apply to each category. Sorry.
Chris, I think what Christy was saying, if we have a cap, would that be per day? So if an event, let's say event A we have a cap of 2,500 on this thing. So cap one day it's 2,500, but if event B has 3 days, would they get potential of 2,500 per day or is that closer to what you're thinking, Christy?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, just to add on, for this number 1, I had the same question about, what was the logic or background to coming up with that $2,500 amount. I wanted to check in to see if there was some legal reasons or anything for doing certain amounts, or it was just an amount you guys just kind of put out there for us to have a starting place for discussion.
I created the amount because I had interpreted previous comments of emerging events festivals need some seed money to get going. And I interpreted that as it's typically not because these aren't likely, I'm making some assumptions here, new events, smaller, trying to get off the ground, that this would be kind of seed capital to help them get going. And somewhere in my notes, I think someone referenced a dollar amount in this area, but I may have heard that incorrectly.
I believe this is also a similar amount that other locations do for this type of grant process. Specifically, I think I was looking at Travel Portland's requirements, and they had 2,500 listed as an amount.
That's great. I didn't even know that, so I'm not.
Jonathan?
I
see you
think
trying
that's
to chime
actually
in.
a good divider for an emerging event or a brand new event. I think 2,500 may be a little low. Just putting on events, there's not a lot you can do with $2,500, honestly. So maybe 5 or 10 could be the cap. But if it's a brand new event with a brand new event producer, and they're asking for 50 grand, I don't know that if they don't have a demonstrated record of success, we would want to put that behind them. If it's an experienced event producer putting on a brand new event and asking for 50 grand, they could come in at category 2 with no cap because they're more experienced. But if we're going to have a streamlined application where they can come in because they're new, they don't know what they're doing, they want the support, and we want to get behind them and put some wind behind them, I think that's what I'm seeing as the first category, being where we're kind of helping spark something new. But if they're going to ask for a ton of money, hopefully they have some experience and they could come in at number 2.
Yeah, I
Well,
guess to
and-
piggyback off of what Temple just said, if somebody's new to Vancouver but has had 3+ years of experience in this similar type event somewhere else, would that then qualify for a number 2 type grant versus a number 1? Chris?
And also, just back to my original statement on the $2,500, the grant that was asked for was, I believe, 75,000, and I believe we had recommended 50, but it was also a month-long event. So I think we need to make sure that we aren't putting ourselves into a corner where we don't have the flexibility to maybe do something that is a little bit larger that could be very profitable back to the city in tax dollars over a longer period of time.
For number 2, if it's a new event, they can still apply for number 2 though, correct?
It's a question. I don't know.
Okay, I was
That's
just
what we're
wondering if
kinda-
that was what your intent was in outlining this. Because the way that the first time I read through it, it was like an or in my mind, but now reading through it again, it sounds like a first time event could apply for either. So if it's just a small event that just like little Kickstarter, like why go through the whole process, versus someone that is asking for that 50K, they would go through that number 2, even if they were a first event.
I'd recommend putting it, like thinking of it that way, sort of, filing your taxes. You can do the full 1040, or if you're able to do the easy form, why not, yeah.
I like that analogy.
Oh, I remember those days.
Yeah, so maybe the categories are slightly different. It's not necessarily new versus established. It's yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Chris, reflecting on last conversation, if I remember correctly, some of the motivation for that category number 2 was the objectivity that might be required in calculating the populations that would be coming. I think the group recognized that there's some squishiness to estimating attendees, and so that squishiness might be able to edge in under the easy form, but might be a little tougher to justify under the full 1040.
Yeah, especially with groups that are coming back for the 5th, 7th, or 10th year.
Yeah, the reference to it's going to probably be a different application. You're going to have to demonstrate much more rigorous impact reporting, answering these certain questions, whereas the first category is, we know you're probably not in a position to know all that or have the resources to figure all that out, but we want to encourage the entrepreneurial side of these events. So I could see something more kind of, yeah, maybe these categories aren't getting exactly, I think the intent, we know what we're saying, but we don't want to, what I'm hearing is close the door on a newer event that can justify and go through that rigorous process for more money. So, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that,
I
am I
thought
hearing,
that's
I'm
a good
looking at
summary.
nods, I'm
Mhm.
seeing nods, but okay. So maybe some reframing of what this, it's not the right title for that, but okay.
Chris, question on number 4, if I'm reading this right, I think we talked about in general discussions, like if a field or a court or something wants to update their facility, you're saying they don't necessarily have to be a nonprofit to be able to qualify for a grant if it's a capital expense to improve that would maybe bring in bigger tournaments or?
So limitations here, and Jonathan, make sure I say this correctly. If it's a capital expense, it has to be owned by the city or the public facilities district. That's RCW. We can't get around that. If it's a non-capital expense, so let's say if it's a non-capital expense, that's more of a programmatic fund that's related to marketing, let's say, perhaps it would qualify.
Okay, thank you.
And really, just a little more nuance to that. If it's an operating expense, then it needs to be a tourism-related nonprofit. Otherwise, if it's going towards tourism, marketing, promotion of special events, it does not need to be a nonprofit. Nor does it need to be the city or a PFD.
Chris, back to the point 1. Some other organizations have referred to, instead of this being a event or a festival tying back to those room nights, that's labeled it more of the category of cultural enrichment. So that does kind of speak to, I can't prove the overnight guest rooms, but I am providing some sort of enrichment into the community that indirectly affects that. And then that helps, I think, qualify that why it would be at the 2,500 or a similar amount to that.
And did you reference, someone reference like Travel Portland does something similar? Would that be a good organization to kind of explore? Or
Yes,
something like that?
yeah. If you just Google Travel Portland large event sponsorships, it's posted on their website. I can send you the link.
Sure, thank you. Okay.
Okay. Do you feel like you got some good feedback on this first?
I do, and
section?
admittedly,
Okay.
I'm on this 4th category. I'm trying to think. I think the capital expense is clear.
Mm-hmm.
What's eligible there, but what would be a catalytic tourism program investment that's not an event or festival, that's not operating of a nonprofit? I guess it would maybe be something, there's a new tourism program being offered by an organization and it needs resources to get launched. It's not an event or festival. It's not a capital expenditure, but maybe it's a new marketing program, or it's a, I think in the past, like the chamber has applied for their, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name. I wish Janet was here. The chamber has their gift card program. I think that's probably something that would fall under that category. I'm assuming that, yeah, we may have to look at eligibility of that, but I think something like that.
It's kind of the other catch-all category.
Yeah, it is a little bit other. Yeah.
Chris, if there were, like, for example, if there were not necessarily a nonprofit, but a for-profit company that started a program that were comparable to the Destination Master Plan project that we heard from Visit Vancouver. A project like that would also fall into that category 4. So basically something that's broadly promoting tourism, but not a specific event.
What was your example again? A for-profit org that did what?
Like the Destination Master Plan, or
That
something
was supporting implementation. Okay.
right, or placemaking for the city of Vancouver, something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to keep us moving. We can always come back because, and we may have answered. So, again, the criteria we're developing, which is a little bit of shift to Matthew in just being transparent. I think he was kind of thinking you have one grant program. What's the criteria? I've kind of given him a heads up that, hey, this is kind of where we're headed. What do you think? How does that impact these criteria in this tool? I don't have an answer to that quite yet, but I've flagged that we may have to reconcile some of what we're working on there. But the idea is if we're developing these criteria to assess impact, it could apply to all these categories. That'd be the goal. I think we still have some work to do there.
I had
Process.
I
Oh,
had
go ahead.
another question.
Yeah.
Before moving on to the next step. As far as, so like, there's an overall amount, right? That traditionally we were giving an overall amount. There's different levels of monies that people apply for, and then we kind of do this thing. So is it like a certain budgeted amount would be for number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4? Or is it all 4 items? However, we would have to decide to spread it out. Correct? Like, does that make sense?
I would say you have this much money and you're going to get applications into these categories.
Mhm.
LTAC is going to evaluate and discern what they're going to recommend. So I would have maybe more of a, well, I think what this is saying is you have 50% of the annual revenue. And if you get really solid applications that are justified for investments, that's your cap. Now it still needs to go through the council process, and I think we talked a bit about the nuance of the baseline budget scenario there, but you would have this cap of 1.5 million, you would get applications in, and technically LTAC could make recommendations for the full 1.5. I think what I would say, and Councilmember Harless, I think, and what you say is, I think council's going to want to see fully vetted proposals that are justified for the use of that money. And it's not about let's spend all the money, because if we don't want to spend money on proposals that we don't think have the impact. So if there's a business case for that, then I think that gets recommended to council for their discernment.
And then
So I will jump in a little,
Okay.
and I think it's adding to what Chris had just said. It actually is working a little bit forward. So you would have to, if you wanted to go above the baseline is how much money you have this year, essentially. That becomes your baseline for next year. If you want to go above that, for the total to spend between the different categories, you would make a request to the city council. Your cap, as Chris pointed out, is about half of that revenue, but to increase from the current baseline amount up to a larger amount needs to be done upfront, not after the fact. Because again, don't be pressured if you don't have good applications. Don't feel pressured to allocate all the money, whatever that threshold is. That money could roll into the next years, and you could advertise that the larger availability of money is available for awards next year within certain criteria. But it does have to be, again, if you want to change the current appropriation from what the currently is allocated for grants to a larger amount, you would have to request that increase, justify, and then explain what you're trying to get to. Kind of, again, exactly what you're talking about. Just it's both before and after type of a, it's
Yeah.
not just let's wait until we have the requirements, because normally you would also advertise that you only have so much money available to award in grants, and then here's your criteria, here are the major areas and the steps that would allow somebody to be successful, and you're working with timeframes of all of these festivals and events, right, as well. So there's like multiple steps that need to be taken into consideration, but the first one again is if you want to increase the dollar amount from the current dollar amount that you have, that's a official process. It has to go to council, and council will decide in November. And then next year, you'd be able to allocate more money for grants.
Natasha,
So what
just
you're,
so
what
I'm
you're
clear.
saying, I just want to make sure, because we would submit a decision package
It would be, exactly. So in
this
city
year
speak.
to
Mhm.
say, we would like the baseline to be increased from 825,000 to 1.5. That
Yeah.
would go through the city's decision biennial budget process through the city manager, city council. If that
Yes.
gets approved, then next year at this time, you have authority for the 1.5, but we
Exactly.
don't, we have to ask for the authority above the baseline, and that we're asking for authority for next year.
Yes, that's correct.
So
Would
Natasha,
we also need to ask that any funds that we chose not to allocate, that those would remain in our fund for future grant
always-
awards or recommendations
Yeah.
versus having that money go into the reserve fund?
Yes, you could absolutely make that request. That's actually easier during the biennium. We don't even have to go to council. It simply would be a communication between you and Chris, and then Chris and finance, and then we have an opportunity. Normally, the city manager designates or delegates the authority to align appropriation between years to finance, and so we could actually do that again within the constraints of the total 2-year appropriation. So if you underspend the money, absolutely, we could move it forward into the next year and then advertise as a larger amount for the grant making purposes, advertise to the organizations that we have more funds to be distributed next year by whatever category criteria you determine would be appropriate.
But it's
So-
too late to get the funds that we didn't spend last year. Or can we ask for that if it's the 2-year period? Can we ask for that back to use in this year?
So 25, you could definitely ask, so it's kind of getting a little too technical. I don't want to throw a lot of technical terms, but it's much easier to do in 20. So once we start 25, 26 is one sort of financial period. So between the periods is harder because only council can appropriate moving budget from one year to the other. So if you have unspent budget, so if you have 825,000 this year, but you only spend, I'll just throw a number, 700, definitely it's similar communication process. You would communicate to Chris. Chris would put a decision package for the supplemental appropriation, but it wouldn't happen until spring. That decision will not happen until spring of next year. And then it would be available next year, but it's just the timeline that gets in the way. Alternatively, this year, in order to get into the next year's budget, our timeline is mid-July. So we just have long lead times for those types of things.
Andrew and I will be submitting a budget package to be considered for the biennial budget.
Yes.
Which would give LTAC, if approved, LTAC authority for whatever that amount is for fiscal years 25 and 26. We're in 2024. Andrew's on here, and Andrew, I'm assuming you don't have to pop on. He's our financial analyst and helps us with all the decision packages and works with budget. And I'm assuming he's taking notes about how there's a whole, as you can imagine, there's a whole process to everything around our budgeting. So he's here to kind of take these notes to make sure we submit through the right processes for this.
So how's this worked in the past? Because this will be the first time that we are ever submitting a request for a specific dollar amount to be authorized. We were told as a board what the amounts were each and every year. So who was making the decisions beforehand? And how did we get a cap of 820? Because that's higher than it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Yeah, so
So who
originally,
decided that cap?
yeah, so originally it was the decision recommendation by staff to city council. It went through the normal budget process. And then that was before significant dollar amounts started being allocated towards Visit Vancouver. As if you remember historically, there wasn't much going from the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee to the Visit Vancouver organization. So once that decision has been made, again, it was a process where the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee made a recommendation to allocate some money for the Visit Vancouver, and that went to council. Council approved it. So you might not have seen the official process, but it was all there. And again, we are audited on it. Like there are certain very strict rules we have to follow
Sure.
for changing
Yeah,
appropriation.
Natasha, I'm not, I was there as part of the member committee that
Yeah.
approved that additional amount, but what I was saying is we approved that additional amount, but we were told at that time that here's the amount that we have to work with. And so as a council, as a board, we said, okay, we want X number of dollars to go of that to Visit Vancouver. And then we
Uh-huh.
want X number of dollars to be available.
Yeah,
Who
that
set
was
that amount?
that
Because
was
before that,
staff.
we were at 400,000.
Yeah, that was staff's recommendation to council, and then council approved it. Because remember, at that point, we didn't have the reserve sufficient to provide the backstop guarantee for the bonds. So the utmost priority was to make sure that the bonds were payable. So that
Sure.
issue, that concern is no longer one of the major concerns because, as you know, we've talked about it multiple times. Now, this year, we actually have sufficient dollar amounts, so it's not really that much of a worry that we wouldn't be able to meet the debt service
We had to,
requirements.
I think what I'm hearing is we had to build up the reserve to meet our debt obligations. We've met it. It's now opening up potentially for council consideration, additional resources for some of these more programmatic grants and things like that. That's what I'm
That's a
interpreting.
great way to put it, yes.
Right.
So the scenario's changed.
My only concern with
The
this
environment
is,
change.
well, with the 50%, right? It seems like that should be, if the other services are met, that should just be available. We shouldn't have to ask for it. It's kind of hard for the council now to go up and say, or excuse me, for the board to go to the council and say, hey, we want to spend $1.5 million on events that we don't even know have applied yet, right? So how do we put the cart before the horse then?
Yeah, and I think you are very on the right track. That's a good question, but that's frequently what we see has happening is that like visioning and purpose is happening in the conversation that you're having right now when you're trying to scope the criteria and the goals and what you actually are looking for. And I think that creates justification for council that will make it easier for them to agree to allocate, to increase the appropriation for those particular purposes. Not to the individual. Council does not need to, at this level, get into the individual approval of the awards. That's what you're doing. It's more having the conversation that you would like an increased grant authority to reach the goals that you want, which is bringing additional people, additional tourists into Vancouver, ideally keeping them here for captive for a few days so they could spend more money in the city and benefit the local economy, benefit the local establishments, benefit our hoteliers, and again, grow the economy. Like it's very compelling reason, and you're on the right track. So I think the request, once you're done defining the criteria, is going to be fairly strong, especially if you couple it with an estimates of how many new visitors are you anticipating, and that's part of your consideration. You might not know exactly who is going to propose what, but we could probably guesstimate based on the historical information and the historical events that you've supported in the past.
Any other questions about the breakout of the different categories before moving into the proposed timeline, just to discuss that portion?
Just one other thought I had, it was in the paragraph below the criteria. If we could look down here, Kim, with it's recommended that LTAC adopt evaluation criteria, past that, the annual resource is not recommended by LTAC or adopted by council would further capitalize cash reserve. So my only question to this is, I guess it sounds like we put together this package and say to council saying we'd like to have up to this amount, this 1.5 million. This is saying if we don't recommend, they approve that, let's say only just do 800,000 like in the past. This is saying that automatically that 700,000 goes back into that reserve fund, which is already fully met, right? Versus having to roll over like it was asked by Carla earlier.
Well, we already kind of touched on it a few minutes ago. So if you would like to roll it into the next year, you technically can. So, but it's a communication, it's a request process. There are steps. So you would just communicate with Chris and then he will work with finance.
Yeah, no, I understand the process. I'm just saying that's not defined here. So if we're looking at a clear definition, I would like to maybe see something like that added in there where there's a process to have it roll over. Because right now it just reads that it's going to roll into the capital. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Process wise, again, we're still working through some of this. Is step one is we city staff engage with LTAC to review grant evaluation criteria and establish kind of budget priorities and goals. That's the visioning, that's the intent. It's how we're going to evaluate impact. I think these are all things council will be looking for. I put a note here. It also includes behind the scenes work Andrew and I would do in coordination with Natasha and other folks around our decision package and biennial budget. So that's kind of June and July. Step two is applications. I'm guessing August is when we would, if we stay on track, but I have a question down below to just caveat that. Ideally, applications would be open for the month of August, let's say, and organizations would apply through these categories. September and October, LTAC would be evaluating those proposals and making award recommendations. We would be party to that. City staff would be party to that. We repackage your award recommendations for a November, December council conversations, public hearing decision in November and December. And then parallel to that, November and December, as council considers the recommendations, they can either adopt, or I think there's a mechanism for them to send back the recommendations with comments and request for resubmittal. That may not be the exact right technical language, but council doesn't have to approve the recommendations. I think they could send it back for LTAC consideration with comments. And then we would take those comments and I'm guessing resubmit or something like that. So I'm not exactly 100% clear on that process, but Kim, I don't know if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, because I had some questions on this timeline too. And Jonathan, I had a question for you as well. First, first I want to say my concern, and then I have a question. My concern is something that I brought up before, which is having applicants apply during the busiest time of the year for events. And if there was ability to push that farther down, that'd also give us more time to, really make sure that the criteria is heavily, we got it exactly what we want it to be. But within the other timelines that would bottleneck that being able to be pushed down, how many touches does this have to have with council? I don't believe it's a public hearing. I can't remember if it's just a consent item Or does it come before on workshop and then consent? So 2 touches plus adding in a
It's-
third?
We
Or-
submit usually consent and council member, you, when your colleagues can pull from consent
Mhm.
for discussion. That's how it's happened in the past. It's either been just approved via consent or during you've pulled it and then we have a presentation ready to walk through and answer any questions.
So it's only 1 touch is all is needed for council legally.
I mean, I think that's ultimately up to you in council,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's only been 1 touch through that process. And I think, you know,
just
you
wanna
as
make
chair have typically played the role kind of with your colleagues of talking about the process that's gone through and helping inform them along the way, in addition to staff presenting, but yeah.
Legally, 1 touch will suffice. Council some has an interest in seeing things more than once, but on something like an LTAC award process for just a slate of a slate of applicants, again, it would be the pleasure of council to decide whether more touches are necessary, but you know, you could certainly, from a practical standpoint, you could schedule an update on, you know, LTAC has been doing some significant work and will be bringing forward a new process and a new approach. You could provide an update like that under communications a week or 2 in advance
Yeah,
to get a
definitely.
little bit advance warning, but legally 1 touch is adequate.
1 touch. Okay. And then, so, you know, if the timeline, you know, if we have 1 touch, you know, there's holidays during December, November, you know, there's only so many council meetings, and then building in the potential, if council wants it to go back to LTAC and then come back to them. So really building out the potential of 2 times having to go to a council agenda, you know, how far out of summer could we possibly make the timeline to accommodate more applicants?
It's a good question. So one of my questions down below, I'm very concerned about this timeline. So maybe it's a question for Jonathan. Does council need to act on the LTAC recommendations in 2024? Or if because of the process we're under right now, and we needed more time and we wanted to give applicants more time under a new process, let's say we pushed applications opening in October for you know, as an example, you would then need to use November and December to kind of make recommendations. Could we bring the award recommendations in the new fiscal year in 2025, or does this all have to happen in 2024?
Great question. So there's not a legal requirement that you make awards this year, except for if you carry over into next year, that's where the budget carry forward process that Natasha was describing would have to be invoked. So at the end, we're at the point where you end 2024 and haven't allocated funds. Now you need to take an affirmative step to carry forward that budget using the city's budget carry forward process.
I'd like to avoid that because there are events that potentially could be in January 2025, for example, just to keep it simple. I think that should be like an absolute last resort.
Yeah. And to that point, we funded an event in January, or one of your awards was actually spent in January. I think it was the Gershwin festival. So that's a really good point. So, but what I'm hearing is maybe instead of August, we push it to September. We'll have LTAC, we'll have to do some work. We'll have to figure out the right process in November, a tricky month, to allow December for council. I think there's a little wiggle room in here to still keep us within 2024.
Because I also am thinking about longevity and sustainability as far as year to year. So, you know, if we set the precedent this year that applications are in September, October, then that can be the start of how we have a consistent application period in September and October. Whereas if we do that in July or August, you know, I wouldn't want to change it next year. I'd want to keep it consistent if possible. So I'd like us to set the standard that we would like this year, if possible.
Okay. let me revisit this timeline with this information, and
Okay.
this is helpful. And then obviously it's more behind the scenes, but once council makes their approves, city staff does go through, we contract with every organization, we get them set up in the system, and then we start the invoicing process. So just so you know, that usually takes us, we had to rush this year because of the event in January for that one, but that's not a small administrative task for us either. I'm gonna keep us moving. Clarifying questions about resources and eligible use. I feel like you guys asked a lot of those questions along the way, but there may be more. Feel like that second bullet we also talked about, got some good feedback on the categories, and I think there's some kind of additional thinking to do there. My third question is a lot going on. So we're developing criteria, we're coming out with new grant categories, we have all these applications need to be rethought and redesigned, it needs to be communicated, it needs to be launched. It's pretty daunting to kind of see this in front of us, and just quite frankly, if this was the only board or commission that I worked with or program I worked with, it would probably be easy. It's not, as well as some of my colleagues. Are you comfortable as we get into this? I'm gonna do everything we can to kind of go through this process right now, but we may kind of run into scenarios where we just don't have the right time. We got to launch a grant program. Are you comfortable with me making recommendations back to you? Here's the changes maybe we can make this year. We know we have some future things that we want to roll out. We'll do that next year, a bit of a phased approach. So kind of want to get your thoughts on that.
Just to kickstart the conversation, yes, a phased approach is good. I would say that the priority, though, would be using that criteria grid that we're putting together as a must for this year.
Okay. I think that makes sense. So technically, we would have this new criteria, and of course, we would communicate it, but the application would look the same. We wouldn't have these new categories. That's not my intention, but I think that's like the lowest hanging fruit we can deliver on that. And then next year, maybe we'd roll out a slightly different grant program or categories and things like that. I think that's what I'm hearing you say, Kim.
Yeah, I mean, ideally all of it.
No. I mean, that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna push it. So that's the intent. So yeah.
Chris, my question isn't necessarily for the timing, but for this new process with the criteria evaluation, council will get a copy of this for each thing that we are sending over for approval, so that way they can kind of see what we were thinking as a board.
I think it'd be great. I mean, it's a much more objective way for council to understand why LTAC made the decisions they did, and they can understand the rigor that you went through. I mean, I'm gonna make an assumption. I think council will appreciate that piece of it.
Yeah, definitely will. And I plan to bring it up, leading, like, you mentioned earlier during council communications, give them an update about what LTAC has been doing and how they'll see in a couple weeks, give them a copy of that for them to look at so they're not surprised. They don't like surprises.
Any other questions?
So you mentioned that staff there's a potential request for staff to request that LTAC funds be used. How does that fit in with this grant? Like, do you apply as a grant recipient, or how does that process work?
Jonathan, I could use your help. I think Yeah, Jonathan, I don't know if you're still there. You may have to step away.
Yeah.
Or Andrew, you're popping on. Do you remember?
I
So,
think it would be a request, so by you and Andrew putting the request before the committee and have the committee approve what the dollar amount is.
So
And
you
then,
would, yeah, I think that's what I was trying. I know we've talked about this, and I think what we would do is you have those 4 grant criteria. We would also submit the administrative cost proposal, and then that full package is what it would actually be 5 different recommendations, one for each of the 4 grant categories, and then a 5th for administrative costs. So like 5
Okay.
elements of the recommendation would include 5 different elements, that 5th being the administrative cost.
Okay.
And we would bring that to LTAC, share that with you and get your comments and feedback.
Would half of the funding come out of the funds that are going into the reserves, or would it all come out of the other? I mean, since we're talking about the total dollars, would those administrative and staffing fees be split evenly amongst the 2 pools of money?
normally admin comes out of the top and then the rest is spent on whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever purpose.
And I had one other question back to the grant timelines. Are we still considering that the people could apply more than 1 time a year?
Yes,
In the
I
future?
almost tried to
maybe?
work that in, and my recommendation at this point is that feels like once we get this new program and process set up, I think, and communicated to stakeholders, I think in the future, maybe next year we could roll out a 2 times a year process. I just, quite frankly, I need to be able to manage kind of through the big changes we're making. So I'd maybe say, great idea. I like it personally, but that may be kind of a phase 2 we roll out in the future. If you're okay with that, it's your call.
Yeah, I'm supportive of that. That sounds good. We don't have anyone from the public here, correct? So I think we have the remaining 7 minutes for ourselves.
Jonathan did weigh in that proposal where it would be kind of that 5th recommendation for admin staff time is accurate. So,
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Good. Awesome. So we have 6 minutes left. Is there any public comment? No. Okay. And then we don't need an executive session. So if there's any more questions, Jennifer, was your hand raised or were you stretching?
I was swatting a fly.
Oh. Awesome. Well, I hope this answered a lot of questions for folks. It certainly did for me. And Jonathan, I see you just popped back. Did you have anything you wanted to add before we close up?
No, thank you. I apologize, had some trouble with my camera there for a minute, but I heard Chris's response to the staff allocation question. It was spot on. And thank you all for the great questions today. I really appreciate
that. Chair Harless, just real quick for next meeting in July. Do you mind if I just frame that? Okay. So next meeting, next week is our regular scheduled LTAC. That's where Matthew was kind of taking your input and going to have a draft proposal. So it'll be all focused around the criteria and the tool. So that's the focus of the June meeting. July meeting is on everyone's calendar, but if you remember from our kind of annual work plan, we left it blank, maybe thinking maybe we won't need it. I'm guessing, let me kind of think about this some more, that we may want to utilize that July meeting to kind of further bring back some of the revisions based on your comments, questions, have more answers to those, so that we would utilize July to make further progress about kind of this direction we're going. So that's a short way of saying I think we should probably meet in July, particularly if we still have a goal of keeping this process and getting it all complete by 2020, end of 2024. Understand summers are difficult and people vacation and everyone should vacation. So assuming we have a quorum, we'll kind of move forward in that regard.
Sounds great. Any last questions, concerns? Or things to just add, celebrate, cool things that are going on in your world?
I mentioned the Heights Bike Garden that
Oh, yeah.
that is opening on Saturday, the 8th. I know it has nothing to do with this group, but we had a volunteer event this weekend. We're painting out there where the old Tower Mall used to be in the Heights District. So yeah, if you guys want to check out, we're doing the grand opening on Saturday from 10 to 1. So yeah, should be. I'm really excited to see the finished product. I think we're all going out, or a few of us are going out Thursday to finish painting because we didn't get a chance to finish on Sunday because it was raining. So, but
Yeah, and the Pride block party is also this Saturday as well. It's right outside like Dandelion Tea House, that corridor like Turtle Place Park. So that's another thing to do on Saturday as well. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a
Thank
good
you.
rest of your day. And
Thank you
stay
very
safe.
much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you all.